Back in the day, Yu-Gi-Oh! Removal was pretty straightforward. You had things like Dark Hole and Regeki and Fissure and eventually Smashing Ground. These are pretty much just straightforward spell cards that destroy one or more monsters. They don't have a lot of drawbacks, but they're not very versatile either. Eventually, Yu-Gi-Oh! Got more and more removal, not only in the forms of spells and traps, but also monster effects, and I find that very interesting because one of the ways that you can see how good a deck is how resilient it is to many forms of removal. So as Yu-Gi-Oh! Has gotten older and we've gotten more and more cards that remove monsters from the field, suddenly the criteria, the benchmark for what a monster needs to be capable of goes up a lot, because back in the day the monsters didn't have to dodge that many effects. They just had to dodge things like Dark Hole and Regeki and the other cards that I mentioned, but because of the hundreds and hundreds of pieces of removal that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has gotten over the years, modern cards need to have lots of form of protection, whether or not that's targeting protection or destruction protection. There's lots of different types of protection that modern cards need to have to stay competitive, or they just need to have immediate impacts on the field, so that if your opponent does manage to actually destroy them, they've already gotten some value for you. And for a long time, I mean almost all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, those simple removal spells actually were the best available. When we saw Dark Hole and Regeki being played in almost every single deck, and we even saw Dark Hole getting played through like recently, like it's not that long ago. When you look at Dark Hole and Regeki like 2015, 2016, pretty much everyone still played those cards in their deck, and that's really interesting to think about, that those cards that have been in the game since the very beginning were very popular all throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Well, at least until like the last 5 years, and that's when we see a bunch of different forms of removal come out to combat modern cards. And that's not to say that Dark Hole and Regeki are bad cards. In fact, they're pretty good. It just takes the right amount of cards that they're good against in the metagame for them to see play. We recently saw Dark Hole go to 3 copies per deck, and Regeki is limited, and people really aren't playing those cards even with those unlimits, and that's a pretty big deal. Regeki was banned for the longest time, so was Dark Hole, but as they came off the ban list, people did play them a little bit, and eventually they sort of went away in forms of better removal options to deal with cards that had different protection effects. And I know that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a lot more negation centered than it used to be back in the day, but even when negations were running around, like I think of Evolzar Logia, a lot of people still played cards like Smashing Ground, like eventually Soul Taker, like Dark Hole, and the reason that they played those cards, that Logia could only negate one card, and that could bait its negation. That was a pretty good way to get its materials off of it. But when we look at modern cards, especially ones with already having negation effects, not only do they have these negation effects, sometimes, like in the case of Thunder Dragon Colossus, they also have card effect protection, which means that you can't just use a Dark Hole to bait the negation. You have to actually have other means of getting rid of the card without just using Dark Hole or Regeki to try to bait it. And for a lot of people out there, the first big departure from these old school types of removal was the kaiju monsters. I've made a lot of videos about kaijus, especially in the past when they were very, very popular. Right now, not a lot of people are playing them, but kaijus for a lot of people was like the next step in evolution of removal cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! They were very generic. You could play them in any deck that you wanted to, and much like Dark Hole and Regeki, they just got rid of problematic cards. The big difference with kaiju monsters versus things like Dark Hole and Regeki is that the kaiju monsters, they don't destroy anything. They just tribute the card and get it off the field, and that's really good because it means your opponent can't negate it. You tribute it for a cost, special summon it to their field, and then you can attack over it because a lot of them don't have a lot of attack points, and that's a very, very effective way of getting rid of cards that Dark Hole and Regeki maybe couldn't deal with if they have destruction prevention effects. Furthermore, cards that have targeting prevention, you can't use some cards out there on them, so the kaijus get around that as well. And for a long time, the kaiju monsters were the go-to way to remove cards that were difficult to deal with, like Cosmo Dark Destroyer. And I remember in the past, a long time ago, like 2 years ago, when I first started making discussion videos, I made a video about kaijus, and one of the things that I found in that comment section is a lot of people complaining about those cards. And I get it, because basically where they were coming from is that they put a lot of time and energy and effort into building a big monster on their side of the field, and then their opponent can just summon a kaiju monster and get rid of their monster for free, and they thought that would be too overpowered and too much of a power creep on older cards. And while I can see where they're coming from, because it certainly sucks to have your monster tributed away for a kaiju, in a lot of ways the kaiju monsters are not perfect removal. The problem is that while a kaiju monster does in fact get rid of an opponent's monster, you also give them a replacement monster and you lose a card out of your hand. That is a minus in card advantage. It's more of a tempo play because you're removing something that was in your way and maybe had a powerful effect, but we're looking at strictly card advantage terms, it is a minus, and that can be troublesome for some decks that don't have as many consistent cards. That's not to say that kaijus have never been successful in rogue strategies, but in general, when we're looking at the success of the kaiju archetype, it was mostly in powerful decks that could take advantage of removing their opponent's cards and then having enough powerful cards in their hand to actually make plays. The problem is that boards eventually became bigger than just one problematic monster. Even when we were seeing kaijus being played, oftentimes your opponent would have multiple strong monsters, and you just had to kaiju whichever one was the most annoying to deal with. But then we got to a point when there were so many good cards on your opponent's side of the field that you needed to answer immediately that people started to look elsewhere for removal. And when newer cards came out, things like Raw Sphere Mode and Evenly Match, suddenly people weren't playing kaijus as often. They're looking for Evenly Match, which could take out a ton of cards at one time. Obviously, you had to do a little bit of playing around your own field because to take full advantage of Evenly Match, you want to control no cards, and it makes it a little bit worse of a top deck than probably Dark Hole or Regeki, but still a very powerful card when it actually resolves. If you wanted to deal with a bunch of monster cards, several of which had powerful negation effects, Evenly Match might not be the way to go though, because it wastes your battle phase and your opponent just negates it. In those cases, Raw Sphere Mode is an excellent card to go to because, like the kaijus, it tributes 3 of your opponent's monsters, which means that it avoids the negation effects and the non-destruction effects and the non-targeting effects, unlike a lot of other older cards. However, the problem with Raw Sphere Mode is sort of the problem with things like Lava Golem and Volcanic Queen, and that's that it prevents you from normal summoning that turn. So if you're going to play Raw Sphere Mode, you need to have a deck that doesn't rely on its normal summon, because while it is true that getting rid of all of your opponent's monsters with one summon is a pretty good deal, if you can't actually make any of your own plays, it might not actually matter in the long run because you'll be so behind on tempo. But the problem is Konami wants to keep printing better and better cards so that people buy their packs because they're a business after all, and when you do that, you have to add certain counters to the game. And I know that's sort of up for debate, right? Konami doesn't have to do anything, but when you want people to play your game, you want them to feel like they have outs to certain big boards. That brings us to Super Polymerization, which I know this was the longest setup probably in the history of any of my videos, but I felt it was very important to go over the history of removal options in Yu-Gi-Oh! To arrive at Super Polymerization now at 3 copies per deck. Super Polymerization is the best removal card in the game right now for a variety of reasons. You can get rid of so many different weird boards that Dark Hole couldn't deal with, that maybe Sphere Mode couldn't deal with, and you can do that without wasting your normal summon. You can do that with playing a bunch of cool extra deck monsters that wouldn't normally see play. Konami likes a card like Super Polymerization because it means that they can create powerful decks like Danger Thunder Dragons, but if people have 3 copies of Super Poly in their meta deck, or maybe their rogue deck, or maybe even their casual deck, they can occasionally steal wins off of Thunder Dragon. Sure, it's not the best thing to draw, maybe just drawing Artifact Lancia early or a powerful Effect Veiler or Impermanence on the right card could stop your opponent's combo entirely, but I think what makes Super Poly so appealing is that it's not a hand trap. You don't have to draw it in your opening 5 cards. If you're playing cards like Pot of Desires or Extravagance, you can draw into it. You can even draw it for turn when your opponent already has a big board, and that's what makes Super Poly so appealing. Right now, we see a lot of players using Starving Venom Dragon to deal with Thunder Dragon boards, but what makes Super Polymerization so appealing is that it'll likely see play even after Thunder Dragons have left the format, even after Orcus have left the format, and the reason is that there are so many random fusion monsters that take very specific cards to summon them that Super Poly will always be a powerful removal option, at least until Konami prints something better. And keep in mind that when Super Poly came out, and when even Super Poly was banned, it wasn't actually this powerful. It didn't have this many cool cards you could summon. It's not just Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. There are so many other cards. I'll throw some of them on the screen right now. We have like the World Chalice Fusion Monster, which just takes any 3 Link monsters. That's sort of a preemptive hit to any deck that would want to extra link you, like Goki's used to do back in the day. But also, they don't have to worry about negation effects because Super Poly, I mean, for lack of a better term, it is a spell speed 4, which is not an official term, but basically it means that your opponent can't respond when you activate Super Polymerization. So they can't just negate it like they could with Dark Hole or Regeki. Super Polymerization is like the best removal spell that we've had in a long time, at least with these new fusion monsters that you can play. And I think Konami really wants it in the game. That's why they've moved it from 1 copy to 2 copies to 3 copies after keeping it banned for a long time. Right now is the perfect spot for it because it's so powerful against two of the top decks, Orcus and Thunder Dragons, so it makes sense that Konami has brought it back to 3 copies per deck to sort of nerf those decks a little bit. Sure, your opponent's not always going to draw the Super Poly if you're playing Thunder Dragons, but enough of them will, maybe even enough to keep Thunder Dragons from being the best deck of the format. Thunder Dragons and other combo decks like that are always going to be powerful, especially if they have the right tools to beat the other decks out there, but when you include something like Super Poly into your deck, you have a much better chance of beating them instead of just having to draw the hand traps in your opening 5 cards. In other words, much like I felt like the Kaiju monsters were the evolution of things like Dark Hole and Regeki, Super Polymerization really was inevitable. If Konami wanted to keep printing these cards that create these crazy boards, Super Polymerization is the best out to them, so it makes sense that Konami would want to put the card to 3 copies per deck if the meta calls for it as a counter. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Removal spells ending with Super Polymerization. Where do you think Konami will go from here? Is it just printing more fusion monsters that Super Poly works with, or is it something even better? I know a lot of people joke about how crazy it is to get rid of cards these days, and while it is true that many cards do have protection effects, I think that Super Polymerization is a pretty decent, if not great, counter to many of the top strategies out there. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.